On September 6, 1976, at exactly 13 hours 11 minutes, Japanese air traffic controllers at Hakodate Airport received an emergency transmission that would change the course of Cold War aviation history forever. A Soviet pilot, flying the most feared interceptor aircraft in the world, was requesting permission to land on Japanese soil. The aircraft descending through the clouds that day was no ordinary fighter jet. It was a Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat, designated by NATO as the most dangerous interceptor ever built by the Soviet Union. Western intelligence agencies had spent years trying to understand this mysterious aircraft. Satellites had photographed it. Spies had risked their lives trying to gather information about it. And now, impossibly, one was about to land on a Japanese runway. The pilot's name was Viktor Ivanovich Belenko. He was a senior lieutenant in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, and in the span of a single morning, he had committed the most significant act of aerial defection in Cold War history. What the CIA would discover in the weeks that followed would shock the intelligence community to its core. The aircraft they had feared for nearly a decade, the fighter that had caused the United States to spend billions of dollars developing countermeasures, was not what it appeared to be. Moscow's greatest weapon was, in many ways, a carefully constructed illusion. Before we continue with this incredible true story, if you're finding this fascinating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one, stories that reveal the hidden truths behind history's most dramatic moments. Now, let us go back to the beginning to understand how Viktor Belenko came to make the decision that would alter his life forever and expose one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets. Viktor Belenko was born on February 15, 1947, in the city of Nalchik, located in the North Caucasus region of the Soviet Union. His childhood was marked by the harsh realities of post-war Soviet life. His father abandoned the family when Viktor was just 2 years old, leaving his mother to raise him alone in conditions of extreme poverty. The young Viktor grew up in a small apartment that barely had enough space for the two of them. In winter, the heating was often inadequate, and he would fall asleep wearing multiple layers of clothing, dreaming of a different life. His mother worked long hours at a state-run factory, often coming home exhausted, with barely enough energy to prepare a simple meal of black bread and watery soup. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Viktor developed an intense determination to escape his circumstances. He found refuge in books about aviation, devouring stories of legendary pilots who had defended the motherland during the Great Patriotic War. The idea of flying above the clouds, of leaving the gray concrete blocks and muddy streets far below, became his obsession. At school, Viktor excelled in mathematics and physics, subjects that he knew would be essential for a career in aviation. His teachers recognized his potential, though they warned him that becoming a pilot required more than academic achievement. It required connections, political reliability, and unwavering loyalty to the Communist Party. Viktor understood these requirements all too well. He learned to say the right things at party meetings, to express enthusiasm for socialist ideals, even when his stomach growled from hunger. He became skilled at presenting the version of himself that the system demanded, while keeping his true thoughts carefully hidden. In 1965, at the age of 18, Viktor was accepted into the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School for pilots. The moment he received his acceptance letter, he felt as though his entire life had been leading to this point. Finally, he would learn to fly. The training was brutal. Cadets were pushed to their physical and mental limits, subjected to grueling exercises designed to weed out those who lacked the necessary dedication. Viktor thrived in this environment. The discipline required was nothing compared to the hardships he had already endured. While other cadets complained about the early morning runs and the strict regulations, Viktor saw them as minor inconveniences on the path to his dream. He made his first solo flight on a clear spring morning in 1966. As his aircraft lifted off the runway and climbed into the blue sky, Viktor experienced a sense of freedom he had never known before. Up there, above the patchwork of collective farms and industrial complexes, there were no party officials to please, no informants to watch his words around. There was only him, the aircraft, and the endless sky. After graduating near the top of his class in 1970, Viktor was assigned to various units before eventually being transferred to the 513th Fighter Regiment at Shuguyevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East. It was there, in 1973, that he first encountered the aircraft that would change everything, the MiG-25 Foxbat. The MiG-25 was surrounded by an aura of mystery and fear. In the West, intelligence analysts had been tracking its development since the mid-1960s, when satellite photographs first revealed the existence of a large, twin-engine interceptor at Soviet test facilities. The aircraft's enormous size and the preliminary speed estimates suggested capabilities that far exceeded anything in the American arsenal. When the MiG-25 made its public debut at the Domodedovo Air Show in 1967, Western observers were stunned. The aircraft appeared to be a technological marvel, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3 and altitudes above 80,000 feet. American intelligence analysts concluded that this was a highly maneuverable air superiority fighter that could outperform anything the United States could put in the sky. This assessment would prove to be catastrophically wrong, but at the time it triggered a panic in the American defense establishment. The F-15 Eagle program was accelerated specifically to counter the perceived threat of the MiG-25. Billions of dollars were allocated to develop new radar systems, missiles, and countermeasures. The Foxbat, without firing a single shot, had already won a major victory in the Cold War arms race. Viktor Belenko arrived at Chuguyevka filled with patriotic pride, eager to fly the aircraft that represented the pinnacle of Soviet aviation technology. His first close-up view of the MiG-25 took his breath away. The aircraft was massive, nearly 70 feet long, with a wingspan of 46 feet. Its twin Tumansky R-15 engines produced an incredible 49,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner. On paper, it was a beast unlike anything else in the sky. But as Victor began his training on the aircraft, his initial enthusiasm gave way to a growing sense of unease. The reality of the MiG-25 was very different from the propaganda that surrounded it. The first thing Victor noticed was the cockpit. For an aircraft supposedly representing the cutting edge of Soviet technology, the instruments seemed antiquated. The avionics relied heavily on vacuum tubes rather than the solid-state electronics that were becoming standard in Western aircraft. The radar system was powerful but crude, producing so much heat that it could cook a rabbit at close range. Pilots joked darkly that if you stood in front of the aircraft with the radar on, you would be sterilized. The aircraft's construction was equally surprising. Instead of the titanium that Western analysts assumed comprised the airframe, the MiG-25 was built primarily from nickel steel. This made the aircraft incredibly heavy, weighing over 64,000 pounds at maximum takeoff weight. The steel construction was chosen not for performance reasons, but because the Soviet Union lacked the expertise and industrial capacity to work with titanium on such a large scale. This weight had severe consequences for the aircraft's capabilities. The MiG-25 was not the nimble dogfighter that Western intelligence feared. It was designed purely as a high-speed interceptor, intended to climb rapidly, accelerate to tremendous speeds, fire its missiles at incoming bombers, and return to base. In anything resembling a dogfight, it was a liability. At speeds below Mach 2, its maneuverability was poor. Its engines were fuel-hungry monsters that gave the aircraft a combat radius of just over 300 miles. Perhaps most troubling to Victor was the aircraft's reliability record. Engine failures were common. The R-15 engines were stressed to their absolute limits, and they had an operational life of just a few hundred hours before requiring complete overhaul. Pilots were under strict orders never to exceed Mach 2.8 in operational flight, because doing so would cause irreversible damage to the engines. The Mach 3 capability that so frightened Western analysts was theoretical, achievable only if the pilot was willing to destroy the engines in the process. Victor also became increasingly aware of the conditions under which he and his fellow pilots served. Chuguyevka Air Base was located in a remote region of the Soviet Far East, near the border with North Korea and China. The climate was harsh, with bitter winters that lasted for months. The base facilities were primitive, with inadequate heating, poor food, and limited recreational opportunities. The pilots lived in cramped quarters that were often infested with insects. Their families, who were required to live nearby, endured even worse conditions. Victor watched as married pilots struggled to maintain their relationships under the strain of long separations and substandard housing. Alcoholism was rampant, as men turned to vodka to cope with the boredom and frustration of their isolated existence. What disturbed Victor most was the political atmosphere that pervaded every aspect of military life. Informants were everywhere, watching and listening for any sign of ideological unreliability. Pilots were required to attend endless political education sessions, where they recited the glories of socialist achievement and the decadence of the capitalist West. Any deviation from the official line could result in career destruction, or worse. Victor had learned to navigate these political waters since childhood, but as he grew older, the constant pretense became increasingly unbearable. He began to question everything he had been taught about the superiority of the Soviet system. If the MiG-25, supposedly the crown jewel of Soviet aviation, was so deeply flawed, what else had been lies? He started to seek out information about the West, a dangerous activity that could easily result in arrest and imprisonment. Through carefully cultivated contacts and surreptitious listening to foreign radio broadcasts, Victor pieced together a picture of life outside the Soviet Union that bore no resemblance to the propaganda he had been fed. Americans, he learned, were not the oppressed wage slaves depicted in Soviet media. They had cars, houses, freedoms that seemed almost unimaginable. The decision to defect did not come suddenly. It grew slowly over months and years, nurtured by disillusionment and desperate hope. Victor began to formulate a plan, one that would require patience, precision, and nerves of steel. The morning of September 6th, 1976, began like any other training day at Chugievka Air Base. Victor awoke early, ate a sparse breakfast in the officers' mess, and reviewed the day's mission briefing. He was scheduled to participate in a training exercise involving simulated intercepts of target drones. Victor dressed in his flight suit with the same meticulous care he always displayed, but this morning was different. Hidden beneath his calm exterior was a storm of emotions: fear, excitement, determination. He had run through the plan countless times in his mind, calculating fuel consumption, distances, radar coverage. Everything hinged on the next few hours. At the pre-flight briefing, Victor listened attentively, nodding at the appropriate moments, asking routine questions to avoid any suspicion. He noticed nothing unusual in the attitudes of his fellow pilots or the political officers who monitored their every move. They suspected nothing. He walked out to the flight line, where his MiG-25P stood waiting. The aircraft's sleek fuselage gleamed in the morning sun, its twin engines ready to carry him into the sky. As Victor conducted his pre-flight inspection, running his hands over the aircraft's surface, he felt a strange mixture of gratitude and contempt. This machine had been his life for 3 years. Now it would be his ticket to freedom. Victor climbed into the cockpit and settled into the ejection seat. He ran through the startup procedures, bringing the massive engines to life. The familiar roar filled his ears as the aircraft trembled with barely contained power. Ground crew removed the chocks, and Victor taxied toward the runway. At the end of the runway, Victor performed his final checks and received clearance for takeoff. He pushed the throttles forward, feeling the acceleration press him back into his seat as the MiG-25 hurtled down the concrete strip. At the calculated speed, he pulled back on the stick, and the aircraft lifted into the air. The training exercise called for Victor to climb to high altitude and intercept simulated bomber targets approaching from the east. Instead, after reaching his assigned altitude, Victor made a decision that would change the course of his life and Cold War history. He pushed the stick forward, sending the MiG-25 into a steep dive. As the aircraft plunged toward the Earth, Victor felt the G-forces pressing against his body. He was descending below Soviet radar coverage, into the dead zone, where ground-based systems could not track him. At low altitude, Victor turned east toward the Sea of Japan. The fuel gauge showed adequate reserves for what he had planned, but there was no margin for error. Every minute, every mile had been calculated to ensure he reached his destination before the tanks ran dry. Flying at low altitude, Victor crossed the Soviet coastline and headed out over the open water. The MiG-25 skimmed above the waves, its engines gulping fuel at an alarming rate. Victor resisted the temptation to climb to a more fuel-efficient altitude. Climbing meant detection, and detection meant Soviet interceptors scrambling to bring him down. For nearly 30 minutes, Victor flew in this precarious state, watching the fuel gauges drop while scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. His radio crackled with increasingly urgent calls from his home base, demanding to know his position and status. Victor maintained radio silence, knowing that any response would give away his location. As he approached Japanese airspace, Victor began to climb, accepting the increased fuel consumption for the safety of altitude. He needed to contact Japanese air traffic control to make his intentions clear before their fighters could interpret his approach as hostile. Victor switched his radio to the international emergency frequency and transmitted in halting English, a language he had secretly studied for this very moment. His message was simple but urgent. He was a Soviet pilot, requesting permission to land in Japan, requesting political asylum. The response came quickly. Japanese fighters were being scrambled to intercept him. Victor was instructed to maintain his current heading and prepare for escort to a suitable airfield. The message was delivered in a tone of professional calm that Victor found reassuring. He was going to make it. 2 Japanese F-4 Phantom fighters appeared on either side of Victor's aircraft, their pilots eyeing the legendary Soviet interceptor with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Victor followed their instructions precisely, maintaining formation as they guided him toward Hakodate Airport on the northern island of Hokkaido. Hakodate was a civilian airport, not equipped to handle military aircraft. Victor had chosen it specifically because it was the closest suitable runway to the Soviet border, maximizing his chances of arrival before fuel exhaustion. As the airport came into view, Victor realized with sudden horror that he had miscalculated something. The runway at Hakodate was shorter than he had estimated. The MiG-25, designed for military airfields with long runways, would need every inch of available space to stop, and his fuel situation was even more critical than he had thought. The low-altitude flight had consumed more than his calculations predicted. Victor lined up his approach with grim determination. There was no option for a go-around. This landing would work, or it would end in disaster. He lowered the landing gear and watched the runway rushing toward him through the cockpit glass. The MiG-25 touched down hard, its tires screeching against the concrete. Victor immediately deployed the braking parachute and stood on the brakes with all his strength. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, but the end of the runway was approaching at alarming speed. Beyond the runway was a field, and beyond that, a road where civilian vehicles were passing, unaware of the drama unfolding just meters away. Victor felt his heart pound as the aircraft continued to slow, the brakes screaming under the strain. The MiG-25 came to a stop with its nose just past the end of the runway, its landing gear on the grass, barely 30 meters from the road. Victor sat motionless for a moment, his hands trembling on the controls. He had made it. Within minutes, the aircraft was surrounded by Japanese police and emergency vehicles. Victor raised his hands and slowly climbed down from the cockpit, surrendering himself to the authorities. As his feet touched Japanese soil, he knew that his old life was over. Whatever came next, there was no going back. The news of Viktor Belenko's defection sent shockwaves through the intelligence communities of both superpowers. For the Soviet Union, it was a catastrophic security breach. One of their most advanced military aircraft was now in the hands of their enemies, along with a pilot who possessed intimate knowledge of their air defense capabilities. The Soviet response was immediate and furious. They demanded the return of both the pilot and the aircraft, claiming that Belenko had been forced to land due to mechanical failure and was being held against his will. The Soviet embassy in Tokyo lodged formal protests, threatening diplomatic consequences if their demands were not met. The Japanese government found itself in an awkward position. Japan and the Soviet Union did not have a peace treaty, technically remaining in a state of war since World War II. At the same time, Japan relied heavily on its alliance with the United States, which was extremely interested in examining the MiG-25. Viktor Belenko, meanwhile, was taken into custody by Japanese authorities and eventually transferred to American intelligence officers who had flown in specifically to debrief him. The interrogations began immediately and would continue for months. What Victor revealed to his interrogators fundamentally changed American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. He provided detailed information about Soviet air defense tactics, radar coverage, pilot training procedures, and the actual performance characteristics of the MiG-25. But perhaps more importantly, he explained the systemic problems that plagued the Soviet military, the culture of lies and exaggeration, the prioritization of appearance over substance, the fear that prevented anyone from reporting bad news up the chain of command. While Victor was being debriefed, a team of American and Japanese technical experts descended on the MiG-25 at Hakodate Airport. Over the course of 67 days, they conducted the most thorough examination of a Soviet aircraft ever performed by Western analysts. What they found contradicted nearly everything American intelligence had believed about the aircraft. The MiG-25 was not a technological marvel. It was, in many ways, a brute force solution to a specific problem, one built with limited technology and significant compromises. The aircraft's electronics were particularly revealing. Instead of the advanced solid-state circuitry that American analysts had expected, the MiG-25's avionics relied heavily on vacuum tubes. This was not a sign of technological backwardness for its own sake. The Soviet engineers had chosen vacuum tubes because they were more resistant to the electromagnetic pulse that would be generated by nuclear weapons, but the choice came with significant penalties in terms of weight, power consumption, and reliability. The Smerch A radar system was powerful, capable of burning through electronic jamming with sheer brute force, but it was crude by Western standards, with limited ability to distinguish between multiple targets or to engage low-flying aircraft. The radar operator in the back seat of the two-seat training variant had a workload that bordered on overwhelming. The airframe analysis confirmed what Victor had told his interrogators. The MiG-25 was built primarily from nickel steel and titanium alloy, with a welding quality that would have been considered unacceptable in Western manufacturing. The aircraft was designed to withstand the extreme heat generated by high-speed flight, but this came at the cost of tremendous weight. The engines were perhaps the most surprising discovery. The Tumansky R-15 turbojets were essentially modified versions of engines originally designed for unmanned cruise missiles, not designed for the sustained operation and repeated use required of manned aircraft. They produced enormous thrust but consumed fuel at a prodigious rate and required frequent and extensive maintenance. American engineers calculated that at maximum speed, the MiG-25's engines would be destroyed within minutes. The aircraft could achieve Mach 3, but doing so was a one-way trip that would require engine replacement afterward. In normal operations, pilots were restricted to Mach 2.8, a still impressive figure but far less terrifying than the theoretical maximum. The most significant revelation concerned the aircraft's role and capabilities. The MiG-25 was not designed as an air superiority fighter, capable of engaging in dogfights with American aircraft. It was a pure interceptor, designed to climb rapidly, accelerate to high speed, fire its missiles at incoming bombers, and return to base. In any situation requiring maneuverability, it was at a severe disadvantage. The Americans concluded that the MiG-25 was essentially a supersonic missile platform, optimized for a single mission. the interception of high-altitude, high-speed bombers like the American B-70 Valkyrie. The irony was that the B-70 program had been canceled years earlier, meaning the MiG-25 was designed to counter a threat that no longer existed. This discovery had profound implications for American defense planning. Billions of dollars had been spent developing the F-15 Eagle specifically to counter the perceived threat of the MiG-25. While the F-15 proved to be an outstanding aircraft in its own right, the urgency and expense of its development had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet capabilities. After 67 days of examination, the Japanese government agreed to return the MiG-25 to the Soviet Union. However, they did so in a manner calculated to maximize the humiliation. The aircraft was disassembled into its component parts and shipped back in crates. The Soviets were furious, but there was nothing they could do. The damage had been done. Viktor Belenko, meanwhile, was granted political asylum in the United States. He arrived in America with nothing but the flight suit on his back and a profound sense of wonder at the world he had entered. His first weeks in America were a series of continuous shocks. Victor had been prepared for the wealth he had heard about on foreign radio broadcasts, but the reality exceeded anything he had imagined. He was stunned by the abundance in American supermarkets, the variety of goods available to ordinary citizens. He later recalled standing in a grocery store, overwhelmed by the selection of breakfast cereals, unable to comprehend how such abundance could exist. But the adjustment was not entirely smooth. Victor struggled with the English language, with American customs, with the freedom that he had craved but found disorienting. In the Soviet Union, every aspect of his life had been regimented. Now he had to make decisions that had always been made for him: where to live, what to buy, how to spend his time. The American intelligence community continued to debrief Victor for months, extracting every piece of information he possessed about Soviet military capabilities. He proved to be an invaluable source, not just for the technical details he could provide, but for his insights into the mindset and culture of the Soviet military establishment. Victor described a system built on fear and deception, where officers routinely exaggerated their unit's readiness and capabilities to avoid punishment. He explained how problems were hidden rather than solved, how bad news was suppressed at every level of the hierarchy. The picture that emerged was of a military that looked formidable on paper, but was riddled with corruption, incompetence, and systemic dysfunction. The intelligence value of Belenko's defection extended far beyond the MiG-25 itself. His information helped American analysts reinterpret years of intelligence data, understanding patterns that had previously been mysterious. Soviet military exercises, for example, were revealed to be carefully choreographed performances rather than genuine tests of capability. Victor eventually settled into civilian life in the United States, though he never fully escaped the shadow of his past. The Soviet Union sentenced him to death in absentia, and there were constant concerns about potential assassination attempts. He was given a new identity by the Central Intelligence Agency, and he lived under protection for many years. He worked as an aerospace consultant, using his knowledge of Soviet aviation to assist American companies and government agencies. He wrote a memoir titled MiG Pilot, which became a bestseller and provided an unprecedented glimpse into life inside the Soviet military. The defection had lasting consequences for Soviet aviation as well. The exposure of the MiG-25's limitations forced Soviet designers back to the drawing board. The result was the MiG-31 Foxhound, a substantially improved aircraft that addressed many of the Foxbat's shortcomings. The MiG-31 featured genuine solid-state electronics, improved radar, better weapon systems, and enhanced maneuverability. But the damage to Soviet prestige was irreparable. The myth of invincible Soviet technology had been shattered. Western defense analysts, who had spent years inflating Soviet capabilities, were forced to reconsider their assumptions. The incident became a case study in intelligence failure, demonstrating how fear and assumptions could lead to catastrophically wrong conclusions. The story of Viktor Belenko and the MiG-25 also offers broader lessons about the nature of power and deception. The Soviet Union had successfully created the impression of military superiority through a combination of secrecy, propaganda, and the West's own tendency to assume the worst. The MiG-25 was not entirely a fraud. It was a genuinely capable aircraft within its design parameters. But those parameters were far more limited than anyone in the West had realized. In the decades since his defection, Viktor Belenko has occasionally emerged from his private life to give interviews and lectures. He has watched the collapse of the Soviet Union, the transformation of his homeland into something he could never have imagined. He has expressed no regret for his decision, viewing it as the defining act of his life that allowed him to live in freedom. The MiG-25 continues to serve in the air forces of several countries, though its numbers are dwindling as the aircraft ages out of service. A few examples are preserved in aviation museums, including one in the National Air and Space Museum in the United States. Visitors who see this aircraft often do not realize the extraordinary story behind its presence there. Looking back at the events of September 6th, 1976, we can see how a single individual's courage and desperation altered the course of Cold War history. Viktor Belenko did not set out to be a hero or a traitor. He was simply a man who could no longer live with the lies that surrounded him, who chose to risk everything for the chance at a different life. His defection exposed not just the limitations of a single aircraft, but the fundamental weaknesses of a system built on fear and deception. The Soviet Union's greatest weapon turned out to be an illusion, maintained by secrecy and sustained by the West's own assumptions. When that illusion was shattered, it revealed truths that neither side was quite prepared to face. In the end, the story of the MiG-25 Foxbat is not really about technology or military capability. It is about truth and deception, about the courage required to break free from a system of lies, and about the profound consequences that can flow from a single act of defiance. Viktor Belenko made his choice on a September morning nearly 5 decades ago. He climbed into the cockpit of a machine that represented everything he had been taught to believe in, and he flew it into the unknown. What he found on the other side was not perfection, but it was freedom. And for Viktor Belenko, that was enough. The gray concrete runways of Chuguyevka Air Base still exist today, though the Soviet Union that Viktor fled has long since passed into history. The MiG-25s that once roared into the sky from those runways have been replaced by newer aircraft, and the pilots who fly them serve a different flag. But the lessons of that September day endure. We live in an age where information can be manipulated on a scale that would have been unimaginable in 1976. Governments and organizations still create carefully crafted illusions designed to project power and capability beyond what actually exists. And just as the West overestimated the MiG-25, we may be overestimating or underestimating threats today based on incomplete information and untested assumptions. The story of Viktor Belenko reminds us of the importance of looking beyond the surface, of questioning the narratives we are given, of recognizing that the most fearsome weapons are sometimes built as much from myth as from metal. It reminds us that courage can come from unexpected places, and that the truth has a way of emerging, no matter how carefully it has been concealed. For Viktor Belenko, the decision to defect was the culmination of years of growing disillusionment. He had believed in the Soviet system, had devoted his life to defending it, only to discover that the foundations were rotten. His choice to escape was not just a personal act of rebellion, it was a refusal to continue living a lie. That refusal had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. It changed the balance of the Cold War, forced billions of dollars in reassessment of defense spending, and contributed to the eventual understanding that the Soviet military was far less capable than it appeared. In a very real sense, Viktor Belenko's flight from Chuguyevka to Hakodate was one small crack in the edifice of Soviet power, a crack that would eventually widen into the fissures that brought the whole structure down. Today, Viktor Belenko lives quietly in an undisclosed location in the United States. He became an American citizen, embraced his adopted country, and built a new life far from the runways and political officers of his youth. He has outlived the Soviet Union that condemned him to death, outlived many of the intelligence officers on both sides who debriefed him, outlived the original MiG-25s that he once flew. But his story endures, a testament to the power of individual choice in the face of overwhelming circumstances. When Viktor Belenko climbed into his cockpit on that September morning, he had no guarantee of success. He faced the possibility of being shot down by Soviet interceptors, of running out of fuel over the ocean, of crashing on landing at an unfamiliar airport. He accepted all of these risks because he could no longer accept the alternative, a lifetime of service to a system he no longer believed in. In the final analysis, the MiG-25 Foxbat was neither the superweapon the West feared, nor the complete failure that some have claimed in the decades since. It was a product of its time and place, a reflection of Soviet priorities and limitations. It was designed to do a specific job under specific circumstances, and within those parameters, it performed adequately. But the myth of the MiG-25 was always more powerful than the aircraft itself. That myth drove American defense policy for years, consuming resources and attention that might have been directed elsewhere. When Viktor Belenko delivered the truth, wrapped in an airframe of steel and titanium, he gave the West something more valuable than any technical intelligence. He gave them perspective. The reconnaissance photographs and intelligence estimates had created a monster in the minds of Western analysts. Viktor Belenko's defection revealed that the monster was, in many ways, a paper tiger. Capable, yes, dangerous, certainly, but not the invincible force that had haunted Pentagon planning sessions for a decade. This revelation had effects that rippled through the Cold War for years to come. American confidence in its ability to understand and counter Soviet capabilities grew, even as the recognition of how badly they had misjudged the MiG-25 introduced healthy skepticism about future intelligence assessments. The balance of fear that had characterized the superpower relationship shifted subtly but significantly. For the Soviet Union, the loss of the MiG-25 was a humiliation that could not be fully repaired. No amount of official denials or diplomatic protests could erase the fact that their most advanced interceptor was now sitting in hangars in Japan and the United States, being poked and prodded by enemy engineers. The secrets they had guarded so carefully were secret no more. The human cost of the defection extended beyond Viktor Belenko himself. His family in the Soviet Union faced immediate consequences, though the full extent of what they endured has never been publicly revealed. His fellow pilots at Chuguyevka were subjected to intense scrutiny, their loyalty questioned, their careers disrupted. The political officers who had failed to detect Belenko's disillusionment were punished for their oversight. In the broader Soviet military, the defection triggered a wave of paranoia. Security procedures were tightened. Pilots were watched more carefully. The already stifling atmosphere of suspicion and control became even more oppressive. In trying to prevent future defections, the system likely only increased the alienation that drove individuals like Belenko to flee in the first place. The aircraft itself met an ignominious end. After being returned to the Soviet Union in crates, the MiG-25 that Viktor Belenko flew to Japan was never reassembled. The Soviets had no interest in reconstituting an aircraft that had been so thoroughly compromised. Its components were likely studied to determine exactly what the West had learned and then quietly disposed of. But other MiG-25s continued to serve, and the type would see action in several conflicts over the following decades. Iraqi MiG-25s flew during the Gulf War, though they achieved little against coalition air power. One of the last combat kills credited to a MiG-25 came in 1991, when an Iraqi Foxbat shot down an American F-18 Hornet. It was a reminder that even a flawed aircraft could still be deadly under the right circumstances. The design legacy of the MiG-25 lives on in its successor, the MiG-31 Foxhound. This aircraft addressed many of the Foxbat's shortcomings while retaining its impressive speed and altitude capabilities. The MiG-31 featured a genuine look-down, shoot-down radar, allowing it to engage targets below its own altitude, a capability the original MiG-25 lacked. It also had improved avionics, better weapon systems, and enhanced reliability. In a sense, the MiG-31 was the aircraft the MiG-25 should have been all along. Its development was accelerated by the exposure of the Foxbat's limitations, another unintended consequence of Viktor Belenko's defection. The Soviet Union was forced to improve because their bluff had been called. Looking back from the perspective of nearly 50 years, the story of the MiG-25 defection seems almost quaint. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union dissolved. The weapon systems that generated such fear have been superseded by newer and more capable designs, but the lessons of that era remain relevant. We continue to live in a world where appearances can deceive, where the true capabilities of potential adversaries are often poorly understood. Intelligence agencies still struggle to peer behind the veils of secrecy that nations use to protect their military capabilities. Assumptions and worst-case scenarios still drive defense planning and spending. The story of Viktor Belenko reminds us that the truth can emerge from unexpected directions, that a single individual with the courage to act can change the course of history. It reminds us that the most impressive-seeming capabilities may conceal hidden weaknesses, and that fear can lead us to overestimate the threats we face. Most importantly, it reminds us of the human element in great events. Viktor Belenko was not a statistic or a strategic asset. He was a man with hopes and fears, with a family left behind and an uncertain future ahead. His decision to defect was born of personal disillusionment, not grand strategy, but its consequences extended far beyond his own life. In the end, the Soviet defector who gave a MiG-25 Foxbat to Japan did more than reveal the limitations of a single aircraft. He pulled back the curtain on a system built on deception and fear, showing the world that Moscow's greatest fighter was, in many ways, a carefully constructed fraud. And in doing so, he changed the course of the Cold War. That is the power of truth, delivered at incredible speed through the clouds over the Sea of Japan on a September morning nearly 50 years ago. It is a power that endures long after the aircraft have been scrapped and the runways have fallen silent, long after the men who made those decisions have passed from the scene. Viktor Belenko's flight from Chuguyevka to Hakodate lasted less than an hour, but its reverberations continue to this day, a reminder that in the great contest between truth and illusion, truth has a way of prevailing. Not always quickly, not always easily, but inevitably. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.